the first daylight raid on Germany with 64 B-17s and B-24s. The air war over Europe had entered a new phase in which fighters would play a crucial role. Back in the spring of 1941, the Allies had gone on the offensive. Spitfires, charged with interception in the Battle of Britain, were now flying bomber escort over enemy territory, and German fighters had but to wait for their arrival. The Luftwaffe had the home field advantage, the more experienced pilots, and with their new Focke-Wulf 190, the superior fighter. By the end of 1942, the British were losing 4 fighters for every one they shot down. That same year, 1942, the Americans arrived in Britain. And with their heavy bombers, the 8th Army Air Force immediately began bombing French and German targets by day, while the RAF took over at night. Spitfires flew escort for the B-17s over France, but no Allied fighters had the range to take the bombers into Germany. The B-17s and B-24s were on their own, facing 600 to 800 enemy fighters on any given day. American losses were staggering. If the bombers were to conduct strategic bombing raids, as theorized by the U.S. Army Air Force General Hap Arnold, it had to be done in daylight, and it had to be done precisely. The Allies desperately needed a long-range fighter. The answer finally came in 1944. The North American P-51 Mustang. With its 2 75-gallon drop tanks, the Mustang had a range of 1,200 miles and up to 8 hours endurance, unprecedented for a fighter. Its 1,490 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and 4 50-caliber machine guns gave the P-51 the speed, 440 miles per hour, and firepower to cope with the Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. And its service ceiling reached 42,000 feet, topping that of its German adversaries. Robin Olds, retired brigadier general, flew the P-51 near the end of the war. He vividly recalls the horror of the air war over Germany, where young men died by the thousands.
Well, I got my squadron, as many of us as could, in amongst the Germans. So there were 10 Focke-Wulf 190s in front of me, 10 right behind me, my wingman, 10 more. It was very exciting. But it was a devastating thing to watch, because these pilots each picked a target as they came down. And when they opened fire, B-17s just fell out of the sky like shrapnel, like rain. And they knocked down 52 B-17s in a space of about 3 minutes. It was awesome. It was horrifying. We, of course, followed the 190s as they stood us the way, got into a scrap with them below the scene of the engagement. And during that fight, you spent more time avoiding falling engines, bodies, wings, pieces of aircraft, flaming balls, loose bombs, the debris raining down were just unimaginable.
The carnage continued, but with the P-51 operational, the Allies now had the superior fighter and the tactical advantage. But the Bf-109 and FW-190 were tough opponents, requiring common sense tactics.
If I've just been bounced, if he's coming in at me and I didn't see him approaching, I'm in deep, deep trouble. And your main idea there is not to be a dead hero, but a live pilot for the next day. So you do everything in your power to avoid getting killed. But remember, altitude is an advantage, speed is an advantage, eyesight, see him first is an advantage. And then you did whatever was necessary. I mean, yes, there were maneuvers, you call it ACM, and they formalize it now to a point where the youngsters today think it's going to be a set piece. believe me, I was never in any two fights that were the same, ever. Each one called for a different application of aggressiveness or terror, depending upon who was in front of or behind whom.
Terror was the motivation on the day Olds found himself being pursued by a Bf-109. Olds was in a Lockheed P-38, which was the first fighter he flew upon his arrival in Europe in May of 1944.
And so I headed for home, some 450 miles away, to only feel my aircraft shudder, and I looked over my shoulder, and there was a 109 behind me, shooting. Well, naturally, instinctively, I booted rudder and pulled hard on the control yoke, and nothing happened, because my canopy had gone in the dive, and it disrupted the airflow of the elevator in the P-38. So when I hauled back on the stick, or the yoke it was, my elevator stalled, and the airplane just kind of went sideways in the air and shuddered, which made the 109 overshoot. It was a good maneuver, you know, just like I invented it. He overshot, so I rolled my wings level, and there he was in front of me, and I pulled the trigger again, and he was number 3 that day. That was a memorable fight.
Germany suffered heavy losses in 1944, both men and aircraft. But Hitler had one more ace up his sleeve, the Messerschmitt 262. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, flying 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter. Had Hitler employed the 262 immediately against the American bombers, the war almost certainly would have been prolonged, costing thousands of lives. But fortunately for the Allies, Hitler interfered with production, and when the jet was finally operational, it was used as a bomber, not a fighter.
To gain air superiority with a 262 would have meant that we got the 262 much earlier. The aircraft was ready. There was too long discussion which road should they fly, and it should have been produced in numbers. We might have changed a timely situation in there. We wouldn't have changed the outcome of the war.
The P-51 Mustang helped clinch the Allied victory in Germany. Without it, the U.S. would have been hard-pressed to gain the air superiority needed for daylight precision bombing raids over Germany. Raids which eventually crippled Germany's industrial output and destroyed the Third Reich. Europe was only part of the global battle. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese bombers taking off from aircraft carriers 200 miles north of Hawaii bombed Pearl Harbor, and World War II spread to the Pacific. The United States declared war on Japan, and 4 days later, Germany declared war on the U.S. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded the Philippines as part of a larger plan to build an impenetrable wall around Japan. It was clear that the U.S. would have to battle the enemy island by island. The vast expanse of the ocean and the great distances between island targets would make aircraft carriers essential for success in the Pacific theater. They would serve as mobile bases, supplying vital air cover for naval vessels and invading ground forces. For the fighter, the Pacific would bring a new task, protecting the carrier and the fleet from enemy attack. But at the start of the war, that was a tall order. American fighter pilots in their Grumman F-4F Wildcats faced veteran Japanese pilots flying a far superior fighter, the Mitsubishi Zero. Zeke Cormier, retired Navy captain, flew the Wildcat in the Atlantic before being transferred to the Pacific Theater, where he became an ace in the Wildcat's successor, the Grumman Hellcat.
In the early days, the Wildcat was not really a match for the Zero. The only thing that saved the Wildcat in its role was that it had survivability, and it brought its pilots back. But in shooting down or countering the Zero, it really wasn't the aircraft for it.
In May of 1942, the Battle of Coral Sea was joined. It was the first all-carrier battle, and the first in which the warships on both sides never exchanged fire. Indeed, did not even come within sight of each other. On the first day of the battle, the Japanese carrier Shoho was sunk, and 2 others damaged by U.S. torpedo planes. The U.S. lost the carrier Lexington the following day. Tactically, the battle was a draw. But the lessons learned at Coral Sea changed the emphasis of U.S. sea warfare tactics from ship defense to earlier interception. Carrier-based fighters would now fly combat air patrols to intercept incoming enemy planes before they could get near the fleet. Midway was next. Just before dawn, on June 4th, 1942, the Japanese attacked by air. Allied planes stationed on the island rose in defense, but the nimble, hard-turning Zeros slaughtered Marine pilots in Wildcats and Buffaloes. Later that morning, waves of U.S. carrier-based torpedo planes headed for the Japanese carriers. 35 were shot down. Still, no hits on the Japanese. It was the dive bombers, finally, that hit the unsuspecting and overconfident Japanese fleet. The Zeros didn't have time to react, and Japan lost 4 carriers. The battle for Midway was over. The U.S. went on the offensive in August 1942 and took the island of Guadalcanal from the Japanese. Carrier-based Wildcats provided air cover for the ground troops and fought valiantly through the long months of the air battle. But by then, there was a new fighter on the way, one that would eventually dominate the skies over the Pacific. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat arrived in the Pacific early in 1943. With its 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder double radial engine, the Hellcat could outspeed, outclimb, outdive, and out-accelerate the Zero. And with its 650 caliber machine guns and massive ammunition load, it could also outgun the 2-cannon, 2-machine gun Japanese fighter. Cormier arrived in the Pacific in the spring of 1944, when the U.S. was already on the offensive.
And so we had to develop our own tactics for the attack phase. And it was just put the throttle to the wall and go in there and have at it. And we found that the aggressive part of it was that the airplane had that capability, and we flew it right up to the maximum capability.
The Hellcats wreaked havoc for the Japanese. June 1944, in the Marianas, U.S. pilots shot down 300 Japanese airplanes for losses of only 16. September 9th and 24th in the Philippines, 800 Japanese planes destroyed on the ground and in the air for 54 U.S. losses. By the end of 1944, the Japanese had resorted to tactics of desperation.
The battle that I remember was off Formosa, and was at a time when the kamikaze was the principal weapon that the Japanese were using to counter the carrier task force. And the ship that I was aboard was the Ticonderoga, and we took 2 kamikaze hits.
Carriers were often the targets for the Japanese suicide attacks, but even the kamikazes could not keep the U.S. fleet from pressing on toward Japan. Zeke Cormier puts the aircraft carrier into perspective.
We never could have won the war out there without the carrier. And witness what we had to do, for instance, we had to take Iwo Jima, which was under the islands of Japan, really, to allow the larger aircraft, the bomber force, to reach the islands. We made a raid on the home islands from the carrier force in February of 1945, 100 miles off the coast. And we hit them with 4 carriers, and we really did some damage.
Control of the skies over the Pacific, made possible in large part by the aircraft carriers and the fighter aircraft aboard, gave the U.S. the base it needed on the island of Tinian to launch the B-29s that on August 6th and 9th, 1945, would drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the final air raids on Japan that would end the war. By the time Communist North Korea invaded South Korea in June of 1950, jet engines were fast becoming standard technology, and the subsequent United Nations police action saw the first all-jet air battle. The greater speeds and higher altitudes necessitated a rethinking of tactics and training, but the role of the fighters remained essentially the same. They escorted the bombers and swept the skies of enemy fighters. By November of 1950, Chinese troops had crossed the Yalu River and entered the conflict in support of North Korea. They brought with them Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighters. The Lockheed F-80, America's first operational jet fighter, was straight-winged and low on power, no match for the MiG-15. Even though the F-80 shot down a MiG-15 first, it was not until the swept-wing North American F-86 Sabre arrived in Korea that the Allies gained air superiority. American Boots Blessé flew both the F-80 and the F-86 in Korea. At retirement, he had reached the rank of Major General, United States Air Force.
The MiG-15 had a better turn radius than the F-86. It was just plain better down below 25,000 feet, and above 25,000, it was over twice the rate. So you had to be careful what you did, and you had to know who you were flying against, that is, what kind of airplane. If it was a MiG-15 and you were turning with him, if you were around 30,000 feet, whatever you were going to do, you better do it in a hurry, because in a couple of turns, that guy's going to go all the way around, and he would know that you're never going to outturn him up there.
At the much higher closing speeds of jet aircraft, a problem arose that fighter pilots had not had to face before.
The visual identification became a real problem because the aircraft traveled so rapidly that the speeds were up, and when you were coming head on at somebody else, by the time you could barely recognize him as a spot in the sky, you could count to about 1001, 1002, 1003, and you had to turn around and look at him going the other way. And that wasn't very much time to identify, to fire, get yourself in position and fire at him.
But the jet's speed and its ability to sustain G-forces pushed pilots to the very limit of their skills and physical abilities. Everything happened much faster in machines many times more complex than the ones that had gone before. 3 factors prevailed. The realization that corner velocity was the key to kills, that training made aces, and that hand, eye, and heart were still the basic qualities of the fighter pilot. Second by second in the cockpit, Boots Blessé takes us into the fighter pilot's world.
And he turned into me, and when I saw him, I started cutting him off in the turn, and then I saw his wing drop, and he turned into me, and that was something I'll never forget as long as I live. I could feel the hair stand up on the back of my neck, and it was just the thought. When I saw his wing drop, I knew he saw me, and I saw him, and one of the two of us wasn't going home. And that was something that training never gave me that. And we got into it, and he crossed at a rather high angle, and I traded my altitude, my airspeed, for altitude, and dropped in, and he made a mistake then, reversed his turn, and I dropped in behind him and shot him down.
F-86 squadrons regularly flew patrols over the airspace just south of the Yalu River, known as MiG Alley. These were meant to keep the attacking MiGs from flying into China for safe cover. The Sabres were almost always outnumbered, but their tactics were far superior. Eventually, the MiG simply refused combat, instead flying at altitudes above the Saber's range, until the high-flying F-86F arrived. Then, it was no contest. By 1953, the UN forces had gained air superiority over Korea, and on July 27th, the war was over. The F-86 had downed 792 MiGs for total losses in air combat of 78, a 10-to-1 advantage. Between the Korean and Vietnam conflicts, technology accelerated. New and more powerful engines, airframes, and weapons came along. But design philosophy reflected the widely accepted, yet erroneous belief that dogfighting, now known as air combat maneuvering, was passé. Supersonic fighters would engage targets acquired by radar at long range with air-to-air missiles, not with guns. The Phantom was a fighter bomber, flying both strike missions and MiG combat air patrols. In South Vietnam, strikes were generally carried out against Viet Cong supply routes. In the north, the targets were those things vital to North Vietnam's war effort, such as airfields, fuel reserves, power plants, and supply depots. Strikes were particularly heavy around Hanoi and Haiphong, which was home to all but one North Vietnamese MiG base. As a fighter, the F-4 flew combat air patrols in support of the bombers. But the Phantom rarely performed just one mission. Loaded with both bombs and missiles, it could, and often did, use its bombs to clear the way for the strike force, then engage enemy fighters with its missiles. Colonel Steve Ritchie is the U.S. Air Force's only pilot ace since the Korean conflict, and the only American pilot in history to have downed 5 MiG-21s.
We had a lower, actually a higher wing loading than the MiG, which meant they turned tighter than we, and that's pretty important in an air battle. We had more power, better speed and acceleration, particularly at low altitude, and much better weapons. A much better overall weapon system than our adversary. In the air-to-air arena in 1972, we generally faced the MiG-21 deep into the heartland of North Vietnam, while the Navy generally was against the MiG-17 and the MiG-19 along the coast. The 17s and the 19s were generally more willing to get into a close-in type situation, while the MiG-21 tactic, by and large, was to hit and run. They like to take off, stay low, go high, sneak up behind us, supersonic, fire their ATOL heat-seeking missile, and dive away.
This MiG tactic made missiles all the more important because when fighting against hit-and-run tactics, it's nearly impossible to get within gun range.
Therefore, we selected the Sparrow because of its range and maneuvering capability. There's actually a no-escape zone. If the target is in a certain range and in a certain envelope, there's no escaping a properly fired and a properly operating Sparrow missile.
Ritchie used the Sparrow on July 8, 1972, when he downed 2 MiGs in 1 minute and 29 seconds.
I fired the missile the first time at about 4,000 feet and about 40 degrees angle off, which is approaching the minimum range capability for the missile. The MiG was in a hard right turn. The first missile went through the center of the fuselage of the MiG, and the second missile went through the fireball. 2 perfect missiles under minimum range conditions. On the second MiG, I fired actually inside of number. So what were you saying? The target was way over to the right. I felt surely out of the envelope. And I began to talk to the missile a little bit because it looked like to me it was not guiding. And I which is hard to realize, but it does. It all of a sudden made what appeared to be a 90-degree right turn, splashed the MiG dead center in the fuselage.
World War II veteran Robin Olds came back to be one of the Air Force's top fighter pilots, with 4 kills in the Phantom. Robin Olds made his hit with a Sidewinder missile.
I noticed a MiG down right on the deck, in the center of this melee, doing a figure 8. He's just turning to go to his base, and between him and his base was a small row of low hills. And he saw me, but I'm behind him. And what's he going to do? If he pulled up to go over those hills, I'm going to plug him with a Sidewinder. If he didn't pull up, he's going to run into the hills. I mean, he was between a rock and a hard place. He chose the hard place. When he came up this little valley, here was a ridge in front of him. He pulled up over it, and just as I got daylight from my Sidewinder, I let it go. And it went right up his tailpipe.
At the war's end, the U.S. had shot down 192 MiGs, of which 145 were claimed by the F-4 Phantoms of the Air Force, Navy, and Marines. U.S. losses were 76 fighters. The Air Force Tactical Fighter Training Group, also known as Red Flag, and the Navy Fighter Weapons School were established with the goal of training pilots as they will have to fight. Tactics and training, therefore, cannot be separated from aircraft technology. Technology of both the U.S. and its adversaries.
The tactics that we employ in air combat maneuvering are directly related to what the performance capability of that aircraft is and where technology takes that aircraft. They're also driven by what we perceive the threat is and what the threat's capabilities are.
Navy pilot Captain Rick Ludwig flew more than 275 Phantom missions in Vietnam. And from August 1986 to February 1988, he was commander of Top Gun, the Navy Fighter Weapons School. Throughout the history of fighter aircraft, technological advancements have consistently been based on need. The need to go higher and faster, to have bigger, more powerful weapons, to outmaneuver the enemy, to gain air superiority. It is, and always has been, the threat that drives technology. The threats we face today would be unimaginable to the men who battled over the trenches of France so many years ago. And the technology of flight has advanced beyond their wildest dreams. But the role of the fighter remains, as Ray Brooks explained it.
Get control of the air. And when you got control of the air, you could do anything.